a way, if I could say, because on the 3rd of December 1993, the United Nations also signed an important document which is called the Paris Principles, and those principles have become a booklet that governs how national human rights institutions the world over have to be established and how they have to be empowered and capacitated and how they should operate. It is that document that says to all the governments that you must give it sufficient powers for it to operate, but also you must ensure that it has its independence to do the work that it has to do, and that it operates with the necessary resources that it's supposed to have. So for us, as a national human rights institution, we would like to also celebrate that day together with the 70th anniversary of the declaration. Now, I'd like to welcome the media, in particular. The kind of work that the media is doing is quite closely related to the work that we're doing. In terms of Section 184 of the Constitution, the South African Human Rights Commission is required to promote, among others, human rights and actually ensure that we end up with a culture of human rights. And without the media, we cannot reach the masses that have to know about human rights and that have to know about what human rights can do for them and where we are, what we do, how we can help them, and so on. So your interest in today's event is most welcome, and your daily work in publicizing the work that we do is also very welcome. I would like at the end of the year to thank you. We have issued many media statements, which you have very, very generously carried, which have reached then all the corners of the country. I would like to say thank you. But let me come back to today. The trend analysis reports provided a general overview of the handling of complaints for the years under review. They provide statistical information on the numerous and number of types of complaints received, complaints that have been referred to other organizations, and complaints that have been finalized by the Commission. The methods that we have used in order to finalize the complaints, as well as the narrative analysis of the complaints that have been lodged. The reports also document the use of the alternative dispute resolution mechanisms. Now, ADR is a very important instrument in the promotion of human rights, for the simple reason that when rights are violated or are threatened and you use ADR, you are likely to correct the violation at the same time to preserve social cohesion, in the sense that people agree that a violation has been done and there is a withdrawal, there is a learning process in there, and therefore there is the preservation of social cohesion. People do not go away with a victor and a loser in that regard. So we use ADR, we use litigation, investigations, and national hearings for the years under review. The trends inform Parliament and the public of the trends in human rights violations reported to the Commission through the complaints mechanisms, and the interventions it has undertaken as a consequence to those complaints, or on the basis of its own initiative. The reports provide insight into the types of human rights violations occurring in the country, and has assisted the Commission to adopt a more integrated approach to executing its mandate and resolving complaints received, and to identify issues that require strategic intervention through litigation services, advocacy, research, and other means. The trends also serve as a baseline to inform future strategic initiatives of the Commission. For example, they highlight areas in terms of focal areas where a greater attention is needed. We need, of course, to improve the trends analysis or the collection of data that we put in the trends analysis. We know that the reach to the far-flung rural areas is still a challenge, but we're working on it. The awareness is still a challenge, and we're working on it. Perhaps when there is greater awareness, we will get more people coming to the Commission, and we'll get a more refined product out of it. I know that the Kenyans have got a system in terms of which they even capture the intensity as per a particular area as to what is happening there, and then they use that to formulate the strategy going forward. They use that to decide on how to allocate resources, and we are looking at a similar operation where we will be able to say we think that this is the greatest need in terms of violations, and it is happening here and it's not happening there, and so on, and we then allocate resources accordingly. I will not delve, of course, into the contents of the report, as the drafters of the report will certainly do that. However, I would like to take this time to thank the staff of the Human Rights Commission who have worked very hard in the quest for human rights protection. I would like to specifically mention their leaders, the CEO, the COO, provincial managers, the legal services unit, which has put this thing together, and many other staff members who have made a very meaningful contribution to the report. Their hard work and dedication can clearly be seen in this report. As the report states, the annual performance plan of the Commission sets a target for finalization of cases at 85% per financial year. The Commission has both reached and exceeded this target over the past 4 years. The highest finalization percentage was reached at the end of 2013-2014 financial year, where 93% of cases were finalized. You will note that the report records that at the end of 2016-2017 the financial year, the percentage of finalization was 87%. Without taking too much time, let me hand over to the program director, who will hand over to the presenters, who will give us more details on the report and what it can show us about the state of human rights in this country. Once again, however, let me thank you very much for being with us for the whole year up to today, and I look forward to our close cooperation with the media in the coming years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Alex, I'm going to hand over to you.
Okay.
Ms. Alexandra Fitzgerald is from the Legal Services Unit, and we'll have to...
Okay. Thank you so much. Chair has given quite a good background on the purpose of the report and why we produce it. The Commission has produced an annual trends analysis report since the 2012-13 financial year. This one specifically is for the financial year starting 1 April 2016 to 31 March 2017. What we do is we look at that complaints data that we've received for the specific financial year, but we also evaluate it in the context of the preceding years in order to determine the trends in the complaints data that we've picked up. So the trends analysis report, as you can see from the slide on the screen, includes a national snapshot of complaints registered with the Commission. It also highlights the top 5 and the bottom 5. Here I've just put out for you the top five rights violations reported to the Commission, starting in the first year that we started the report, 2012 to 2013, up until 2016, 2017. As you can see, over the 5-year period of review, the largest number of human rights violations reported to the Commission concern an equality rights violation. The report will reflect that the vast majority of these complaints are related to allegations of racial discrimination against Black South Africans. Race-based discrimination presents the greatest challenge to the work of the Commission, as evidenced by the volume and frequency of race-related complaints received by our provincial offices and our head office. The volumes have certainly increased dramatically over 2015-2016, only to dip slightly in 2016-2017. In relation to these race-based complaints, our provincial offices have instituted proceedings in equality courts across the country to resolve race-based equality complaints. The majority of the cases that we litigated in the equality courts involved the use of the K-word and other derogatory comments, including baboon, ape, or monkey. One of the more high-profile matters during the 16-17 financial year was where the Commission represented Constable Clement Mkondo against Ms. Vicky Momberg. That was done by the Gauteng Provincial Office. They instituted proceedings in the Randburg Eastern Cape High Court. The court found in favour of the Commission on behalf of the constable and found that Ms. Momberg's comments constituted hate speech in terms of Section 10 of PAPUDA, and she was ordered to undertake community service, apologise unconditionally, participate in sensitivity training, and pay an amount of 100,000 rand. The Commission is particularly happy with the high-profile complaints that it's been able to resolve, because we think that the high-profile nature of those complaints sends a strong message that racism is a serious violation of the rights to equality and dignity and is unacceptable within our constitutional democracy. You can also see from the slide on the screen that in 2016-17, the number of economic and social rights-related complaints, which include healthcare, food, water, and social security, increased quite dramatically. We're not surprised to see this increase and this complaint trend, given the endemic poverty that we're still seeing in South Africa and growing wealth and income inequality. We're also seeing, obviously, that there still remains inadequate access to basic services, which are critical for maintaining human dignity and which still affect a majority of South Africans. These problems specifically, because of their endemic nature, tend to be very long-term and often remain unresolved for many years because departments or local government are often unable to or do not have the skills, capacity, or resources to resolve these matters. So these social and economic rights complaints represent some of the most pressing challenges facing South Africa, but we are also hopeful as a Commission that perhaps the increase in complaints being registered at the Commission might also be an indication that people regard the Commission as a body which is able to address these complaints, and so what is happening is that we're also attracting more complaints than we did previously. In previous years, possibly due to our advocacy events that we've been having, we've seen a lot of uptake, we've done a lot of community outreach programs, so we're hopeful that that is also a reflection of more people knowing what the Commission does and what we're capable of. The Chair has also referred to our use of alternative dispute resolution mechanisms. This is a reflection of trying to use non-litigious mechanisms in order to resolve complaints so that we can be more effective, so that we can resolve our complaints more efficiently. As you can see from the slide, 90% of our complaints that were resolved through ADR were resolved successfully. The race-based complaints still account for the highest number of ADR resolution mechanisms that we used. On average, 34% of all complaints addressed through ADR mechanisms were race-related. This has remained consistent. In all provinces, the racism complained of was, for the most part, as indicated before, derogatory comments based on race directed at black people, which violated their right to dignity. Even though we have increasingly moved towards an ADR resolutive process, we are still obviously litigating, and we've done a number of high-profile matters. I've just put on the slide a few of our matters that we've done. But most of our matters that we've litigated included racism and utterances of racial epithets, typically in the equality courts. We've also litigated on the basis of unfair discrimination on the grounds of disability, culture, and sexual orientation. Our litigation on racism, we feel, is really important because we think that we're on the forefront of the discourse of how complaints of alleged racism are resolved. We also have done a number of recurring socio-economic rights issues, including denial of access to land and housing, particularly on behalf of marginalized communities. And these include eviction applications, housing applications, water, sanitation, litigious matters that concern degrading living conditions, where we've particularly looked at the compounded effect that those issues have on women and children living in marginalized and vulnerable communities in South Africa. We also saw during the 16-17 financial year, there was an uptake of a different kind of case that we have been increasingly involved in, and that concerns interrogating practices in the financial sector, particularly where those practices are harmful towards vulnerable and marginalized communities. So we've been involved in challenges against systems of business lending, the law on defaulting debtors, and specifically practices that cause financial harm to vulnerable and marginalized South Africans, especially in the context of endemic unemployment and deepening poverty in South Africa. So we've increasingly are looking at unscrupulous business practices that exploit poor South Africans, and we note that they've historically gone unchallenged as a general proposition. So cases like this have a wide capacity to have a substantial impact on the lives of large communities through those precedents. So I think you'll most likely see the Commission looking into those cases and continuing our work in that area. Of course, we also have our investigative reports. Aside from our involvement in litigation, we have at our disposal this means to directly address complaints reported to the Commission. So we can, of our own accord or at the request of our complainants, conduct investigations into a complaint and, based on our findings, make a determination of remedial action to be taken by state departments. And we are obviously empowered through our Act to make recommendations on that basis. The advantage of holding an investigative hearing or using our investigative report mechanism is that it facilitates an immediate response. We can reach out to state departments and respondents immediately concerning the alleged violation. We make findings based on the outcome of those investigations that we can conduct, and then we provide detailed recommendations to relevant respondents, asking them to take certain steps to resolve the issue or limit the harm. We have noted that we do have an issue with non-compliance with the Commission's recommendations. That's been a historic issue that we've had. It is continuing. Often we don't receive responses, or we don't receive timeous responses. So this does seriously impact on levels of quality and service delivery and planning and effective policy implementation. There is a general lack of awareness of human rights and responsibilities for the fulfillment of human rights within the public service, which results in delays in implementing our recommendations, especially where they're aimed at long-term collective reforms. So non-compliance for us is probably our most serious issue. It compromises the prospect of attaining a culture of human rights in organs of state. We have used many approaches. We use soft approaches. We use harder approaches. We've used our subpoena powers in the most recent financial year. But in any event, the Commission remains committed to resolving human rights issues at using any of the mechanisms that are at our disposal and which are available to us to do so. We also have noted the landmark judgment of the Constitutional Court regarding the remedial action and powers of the public protector, and noting that the recommendations in that case were regarded as binding, and take this opportunity to remind our stakeholders that the Commission is tasked with and mandated to promote, advocate and respect human rights in South Africa, and we are very much committed to our mandate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alex. Right, I think we're going to open it up for questions now. May I request that you please identify yourself before you ask a question? So are there any questions? I've noted you. The only one. All right, would you like to identify yourself?
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Govan Whittles from ENCA. My question relates to the very first slide on the number of race-based complaints. Could you please just specify in the provinces which province had the most of these race-based complaints, and what type of pattern have you picked up in the type of complaints about racism? Is South Africa becoming more racist, or are more people reporting racism?
Thank you for your question. I suspect that it's a bit of both. The Commission has certainly undertaken more advocacy and media and communication, so I think that we're more visible, which is leading people to report to us. Also, where we represent complainants in high-profile matters, such as the Vicky Momberg matter, that raises our profile as the Commission and also informs people that certain utterances are unacceptable, which may also encourage them to report more to the Commission. I don't think that we would deduce that South Africa was becoming more racist. I think that we've certainly pointed in the report to aspects such as social media, which allows people to publish and reach much wider audiences. And if what they're publishing is derogatory or racist or hate speech, then obviously more people see it, will often receive a complaint about it. So that also increases reporting to the Commission as well. So social media certainly, I think, increase the visibility of certain behavior and conduct which may previously we would not have been aware of because it happened in a private setting. Our two high receipt offices are the Cape Town office and the Gauteng provincial office. They are the busiest offices and they receive the highest number of complaints, and it's the Gauteng provincial office that receives the most. So the majority of complaints across the board are all related to race-based equality complaints.
Can you give a breakdown between Cape Town and Gauteng? Exactly how many of is that 705?
I don't have that information. Oh, sure.
Okay, I think if you look at page 23 of the report, which
we've not read that in the report.
Out of the media statement. Okay, so sure.
Okay, while Jane is talking, the Gauteng actually has the highest number of complaints according to the report. 38% as far as issues of equality are concerned, followed by Western Cape at 15% and KwaZulu-Natal at 14%. And we look at page 24 of the report. Again, the highest complaints under the equality sector will be issues of race, followed by disability issues, and then sexual orientation. Social.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think the important point is also that inequality is not just about race. That in the context in which we're working, inequality relates to discrimination based on age, belief, color, etc. And I think it's really important for us to recognize that disability and ethnic origin come after race as well, and they're equally important. And I think that Alex can probably speak a little bit more to it, but disability has been on the increase, and we have seen a significant increase in the number of inequality complaints related to disability. So while race is an important aspect, we also as a Commission feel that it's very important that the other aspects of inequality that are equally important and do have an equally egregious impact on people's lives and on their human rights.
Certainly. I think also in this report we've increasingly noted the how intersecting identities also compound to create more human rights violations. So we're also seeing an intersecting issues where someone might be a black South African who is also disabled, or a black South African who is also gay. So we're seeing where those intersections are also serving to compound human rights violations on a number of different fronts as well. And that's something that we've probably for the first time noted in this report with trends analysis.
Do we have any other questions? Please identify yourself.
Angela from SABC Radio News. You spoke about debtors and unscrupulous business practices. Are these mainstream businesses, or is it people that are not registered?
It's mainstream businesses, predominantly.
So is it banks?
Including, we did have certain matters against banks that we were involved in, either as the applicant or as amicus curiae.
If I may also just come back to your question previously, if you look at page 25 of the report, we have a couple of copies which we've handed out to you. You'll see that the race-related complaints have decreased marginally, as Alex has pointed out, in this year, from 505 to 486. But as the report indicates, they do still remain extremely high and are concerned to the Commission, but they have decreased somewhat. Right. Okay, I'll come back to you. Angela, do you want to ask your second question?
Yes, I wanted to ask about subpoena powers. You spoke about that. Are you finding that most of the time you have to subpoena people in, or are they willing to participate?
Well, in most cases, people do come to the Commission, especially people who are outside government. They readily come to the Commission. You do get just a few people who do not come. I think the subpoena powers have become necessary when we deal with interaction with government. Often, government officials do not cooperate as required, of course, by the Constitution and by Section 4.2 of the South African Human Rights Commission Act, that organs of state are required to cooperate with the Commission in the execution of its duties. And you send reminders after reminders, and you find that you don't get any response, or you get a negative response, and then as a result of that, you then are forced to use the coercive measures. We in the Commission believe, as I said earlier on when I did the welcoming address, and I spoke about ADR, we believe that, it will help South Africa if we can work together and we can discuss things together and solve problems. So government officials, some of them do cooperate, but we have found that others actually just do not cooperate. So it's an area that still needs improvement.
Okay, I'll take your hand and then I've noted you, sir. Do you have another question? Would you mind if we take a new question? I'll come back to you after this one.
Okay, I'm Kautalini Panazila from Jacaranda FM. I'm just going to take us back to the race because I didn't understand. I just wanted to know, with the type of complaints you get, are they based on one-on-one racial incidents or people finding that they're systematically being discriminated against because of their race? Not the K word, not bullied, rather than being paid less or because of their race. Yeah.
I believe that the trends seem to indicate that it's majority cases of one-on-one instances, interpersonal, but obviously the Commission receives, it might not even be a big difference in the numbers. The Commission receives lots of complaints based on systemic racial oppression or marginalization as well, yes.
Just to add to that, where we do receive complaints that relate to labor-related matters, we are compelled to pass them on to the relevant body, so we would then in some instances pass those on to the CCMA or to another body. So we often have to be very cognizant that there are other Chapter 9s that have been established to do different things. Okay.
Thanks. Jacques Brederick from Kyk Net Verslag. We have a problem with police brutality in South Africa, and I see category 3 arrested, detained, and accused persons. Those complaints. What type of complaints are we looking at here? Is this a type of classic assault that you see happening between police officers and people they're trying to arrest, or is there something else to this?
It's quite a mix. There are quite a few things that could relate to people who have been detained because they're migrants or asylum seekers or refugees, because we do have a lot of complaints regarding those aspects. Could relate. There are some complaints that we get that are related to police brutality, although in terms of our referral powers, then often the case is that might be better addressed by other organizations, for instance, IPID. But yes, illegally detained not being allowed their full rights under the Constitution that an arrested or detained person has, and instances of migrants and asylum seekers and refugees being detained in circumstances which don't comply to the applicable regulatory or legal frameworks.
Thanks. Just for the chairperson, Mr. Matola, you mentioned that access in rural areas is one of your main challenges. How much of an impact did that have on the findings of this report, and what is the Commission doing to try and get out to the rural areas? And then secondly, Mr. Gerald, you mentioned that one of the issues you were on was the access to land and housing and complaints around that. Could you just give some examples of what kind of complaints people are making about access to land and what the Commission is doing?
I must say that actually the Commission is doing a lot of work now to try and reach rural communities and to encourage government to make it possible for rural communities to access various rights. We are at the ground level, at the provincial level, for example, working with other Chapter 9 institutions. I've just signed an MOU with the Public Protector, but not to create something new, but to formalize the cooperative working relationship that you find in provincial offices where Chapter 9 institutions collaborate at provincial offices. They share information, they share platforms, and in that way the reach, the advocacy reach it goes further than it used to go. But of course, it still needs us to do a little bit more work. I toured the Eastern Cape earlier this year, and I went to some of the areas where I found that people were not very sure of the existence of the commission or what it is about, and so on. But understandably, because you find that in those areas, the level of development, roads, communication, and so on is very poor. So when we met with the MSC, we told her that really they have to do something to reduce the urban-rural divide, because in some of the areas there's a big urban-rural divide. But we're doing the best we can in order to reach that. We are using the media, as you know, and you help us a lot, as I said, in reaching those areas. But we can do more. We may need to do pamphlets that are in all languages, distribution, visiting those areas becomes a problem. For example, in very big provinces with small offices, with small staff, it becomes difficult to reach every part of the province. But we're getting there. But we need to do more.
If I could just add, if I may, Chairperson. So the Commission does have quite a widespread advocacy and outreach program which operates through all 9 provinces. In the 2016 year, we reached 51,759 people. In the following year, 2016-17, we reached 83,000 people. So we are seeing an incremental increase in the reach. We are using various ways to try to reach rural and marginalized communities. Each of our provincial offices do have advocacy officers who go out and do rural outreach. We often do them in conjunction with other Chapter 9, so we would go out with the Public Protector. We have a range of ways of trying to reach rural communities. One of them is to train the trainer, so we have human rights focal points in communities that can then help assist communities to understand. Also just bearing in mind the complexity of our Constitution in trying to make it simple, trying to make it accessible. We have, in the last year, translated our advocacy materials into all 11 languages in order to assist people in far-flung areas to understand, because rights knowledge is central to rights assertion. If people don't understand their rights, they cannot come to the Commission to lay complaints about their rights. Also bearing in mind the fact that race is still regarded as the most primary site of inequality in the country, that a lot of people don't understand that they have other kinds of rights as well. So we're also on a campaign to try to educate people so that when they do bring complaints, they can distinguish between what is a human rights violation based on race or a complaint which is based on something else, so that we can start to get the public to understand their rights so that they can make proper complaints, so that our statistics begin to reflect the actual human rights situation on the ground. So we've made significant strides in the last 3 years as a Human Rights Commission with respect to our visibility. We've particularly used community media and have been monitoring the use of community media, and are noticing a significant uptake of human rights reporting in community newspapers, not in drops, that are often written in the languages of those communities. So we would say that our advocacy and outreach work definitely did have an impact on the outcomes of the report, because that's what enables people to lodge complaints with the Human Rights Commission.
If I may add, there are two other things which we're doing, which will also help to access, and extend our reach to far-flung communities, as the chair says, rural communities, and also marginalized communities. One is that next year the Commission will be working together with the Department of Basic Education, Department of Justice, and Center for Human Rights at the University of Victoria to run the school's moot court competition. And we've been informed by the Department of Basic Education that the essay competition on human rights will now be compulsory in all schools in the country for grade 10 and 11. And therefore helping the Commission to reach out to all schools in the country, and therefore, by implication, rural areas. This actually presents a very important opportunity for the Commission to actually use the schools to extend its reach. We also have an MOU with the Safer South Africa Foundation, which also runs programs in schools, and our staff members assist in providing human rights education in the schools which the Safer South Africa Foundation is working at. This has also helped us also to reach areas where we've not been before. And then we've also recently signed a memorandum of agreement, with South African police, to see how we can work together with the police, in advancing human rights. We're actually meeting tomorrow in Pretoria, to discuss, how best we can work together. And you can imagine we have over 1,000 police stations in this country, and if we were able to basically utilize those police stations in a much more effective manner, that will also be increasing our mandate. We are currently also in discussions with SALGA to actually draft to sign an MOU again, where we can then work with SALGA and reach out to local government across the country, all the various municipalities. So we are concerned, of course, about us reaching out to all South Africans as possible, and all people in this country as possible.
If I can just add to what the CEO said, also just to reflect that we have also, as a Commission, seen an increase in reporting with the media on human rights. I think, which is also gratifying, because we don't just monitor ourselves, we also monitor the media to see the extent to which the media is reporting on human rights, and to what extent human rights is on the agenda for the media. And in the 2-3 financial years, we've seen dramatic increases in the number of media reports on human rights and on the work of the South African Human Rights Commission in particular. Just before we move on to another round of questions, I think I also just want to point out, and perhaps Alex I'm not sure if you want to just talk a little bit about the complaints that we've received relating to gender at the Commission and our referrals process for those.
Complaints regarding gender, you'd certainly look at our stats and think that perhaps there's a significant underreporting because obviously in the broader context of South Africa, which we all know has incredibly high rates of gender-based violence and sexual violence. But there is, of course, the Commission for Gender Equality, who would seek to either refer to or work with in resolving complaints of that nature. So that would be probably the preeminent commission tasked with resolving gender complaints there. In response to your question about access to land, most of the commissions, or something that's very common when we'll deal with that kind of issue, would be the commission dealing with the issues that start to arise where informal communities settle on a piece of land owned by a certain municipality, and the issues that will sort of arise from that. The municipality may seek to evict them, they may seek to rehouse them, we may need to ensure that people are put on certain lists to be relocated, etc. So those would be the types of issues that would come up frequently for us.
I don't think we need Chris to have a question. Oh, there are two questions over here. All right. Then I'll come to. I've noted you. Where's I've noted you?
Okay, Kateko Mabasa.
Sorry.
You can't hear.
Kateko Mabasa. I would like to ask, in terms of people that you have found to have violated human rights, what sort of sanctions do you put on them? And with regards to non-compliance, what solution is the Commission seeking? Is it seeking more powers to enforce the recommendations? And if so, what type of powers? And the report and the trend overall with what you have discovered, what does that say about South Africa? The increases and the decreases, and also where do we fit as a country globally in terms of human rights violations?
Can I take the second one as well, and then this will be the last round.
Lapana Lamu from the SABC. Will you say it's much more safer for activists to defend human rights in South Africa as opposed to other African countries?
All right. Thank you. Chairperson, CEO, does anyone want to take the first one with respect to the sanctions?
Well, can perhaps he will deal with the sanction. Can I just deal with the powers that the Commission needs in order to make sure that its recommendations are complied with? My sense is that the Constitution is one document that all of us say we subscribe to. Government says, we live by the Constitution. The ordinary person in the street says they live by the Constitution. The Commission says we expect everybody, we also live by the Constitution. And that Constitution says, work together. It says that there has to be cooperation between the, first of all, the Constitution says government has the primary obligations to fulfill the rights that are in the Bill of Rights. And then it says that the Human Rights Commission has therefore to promote, protect, and monitor the observance of these rights. But somewhere it then says that government has to work together with the Commission. If that was to be put in place, there would be no need for additional powers, because then that mechanism itself would ensure that the Commission is supported fully in the execution of its mandate, without having to use whatever powers, enforcement powers. The second thing that the Commission would need, rather than additional powers, I think it would need resources to be able to use existing mechanisms in order to enforce its recommendations. One of those is litigation. that the Commission should be able then, when there is a refusal to comply with the recommendations, that the Commission should have the necessary resources in order to initiate litigation. The subpoena powers are used largely where you are still at an investigative level and you need information in order to decide whether a violation of a right has been committed or not. And you need to speak to certain people, and they either refuse to give you documentation or to come along and give you the information that you need. It's only then that you use the powers. I think that perhaps, other than changing the language in the existing legislation, I don't think that there is any additional powers that the Commission would need. The most important thing is that everybody has to be true to the Constitution, and do that which the Constitution expects us to do.
Thank you. On the sanctions, I just want to refer you to two provisions in our Constitution. Section 184, subsection 2, B, says the Human Rights Commission has powers to take steps to secure appropriate redress where human rights have been violated. And then, as the chairperson was saying, Section 181.3, Section 181, subsection 3, says other organs of state must assist and protect the Human Rights Commission, independence, dignity, and effectiveness. So our mandate to secure redress where human rights have been violated is one of our major mandates. And of course, when we make those findings, there has to be a remedy. And I guess what you're talking about by sanctions. And our view at this point in time, following the decisions of the Constitutional Court around the powers of the public protector, is that when we make a finding that there has been a human rights violation and certain things must be done, that's binding. And therefore, it must be implemented unless challenged in a court of law. And of course, we have the powers as a commission to also go to court to enforce those findings. That's why, for example, we are currently in the court in KZN over Edward Zuma's matter, where we actually found his conduct amounted to a violation of human rights. And we already know exactly what has happened. That's why we took Ms. Mombek to court as well over that. And then secondly, our act, if you look at section 18 of our act, there is an obligation by public bodies in particular to respond to our findings within a certain period of time. And then thirdly, something we really don't use that much is that it's actually a criminal offense under section 4 of our act, that is section 22, to undermine the work of the commission. So if we make a finding against the government, let's say there's a sewage spilling at the school, and we say clean it up, you ignore it. You're actually undermining the work of the Human Rights Commission. You are undermining the integrity of the Human Rights Commission, and therefore that should be a criminal offense. It's something we should not use that much, because as the chair was saying, we were trying to create a culture of human rights. We're trying to influence everybody to see the value of promoting human rights and not undermining human rights. It's very costly. And that's why, we use all sorts of manners. So yes, we can go to court where we feel we have to go, and we have done so. We can also, just impress on those who have violated human rights, to behave differently. And as the chair pointed out, actually, if you look at our total number of complaints, we actually resolve many of the human rights violations by talking to people to say, please stop and change. It's only under extreme measures where we actually have to resort to court. And we should not really be doing so, especially where, in the context of the government, there's an obligation under Section 7 of the Constitution for all organs of state to promote respect and fulfill human rights. And therefore, you'll be failing as an organ of state when you are told that you contribute by the right, and you just ignore it. So that's the culture actually which we are trying to get to as a commission.
Right. I'll answer Lafon's question regarding whether South Africa is a safer country than other countries for human rights defenders and how we're doing with respect to other countries. I think there are a couple of things that are relevant with respect to the context within which we work in South Africa. I think undoubtedly one of them is that we do have a free press which does do its work without fear or favor, and I think that's one of the benefits of doing human rights work in South Africa. I think it's also important to remember that the South African Human Rights Commission is part of a continental-wide body of human rights institutions, and we work very closely with other human rights institutions across the continent. We're part of an organization called NAMRI, so we have constant engagement. South Africa, because of our constitution, is still regarded as one of the places from which best practices does emanate with respect to human rights. The other thing that works in our favor and really does sort of elevate us internationally is that we do have a Bill of Rights, which is justiciable, and that is what makes our constitution so special, that people can and do take power to court when they feel that their rights are not being protected. So we do have a culture of active citizenry who do demand that their rights be protected. And then, of course, we have our constitution, which is globally revered for good reason. So with respect to human rights defenders, I think South Africa is doing really well. And we host a range of study tours every year by international human rights institutions that come to South Africa specifically because we are regarded as one of the countries that does have international best practice. And also the recognition in our constitution that a constitutional democracy is an unfolding process. It's not an event, but it's something that will go on. Ideally, we would want equality to reign and for us not to be as active, but we are. And we are visited often by other international human rights bodies. And on Friday, we hosted Commissioner Michelle Bachelet of the United Nations at the Commission to discuss the work that we do. So I think that with respect to your question, we are highly regarded as a country with a relatively good human rights record and human rights culture. So that answers your question. I'm not. Oh, you want to add something?
I just on that question, I wanted to say that actually it's a very interesting question that you're asking whether it is safer here. I must say that there are many countries where it is safe to promote, protect, and enforce human rights. There are many countries that it is safe to do so without fear, favor, and prejudice. The problem is that there are countries where it is extremely dangerous to do so. One of the countries that has become dangerous is the Philippines, where previously it was possible, to work on human rights, but last year we as the global network of national human rights institutions had to intervene, because of the dangerous situation that was had developed in the Philippines with regard to their national human rights institution, in order to try and persuade the government to put a hold at it. We do have, as I said, that we have many countries in this continent where it is easy, it's not difficult to protect. But we also have a lot more where it is difficult to do so. You've heard there's a country now that has locked up people because they are of a different sexual orientation. You have countries where when you go to the records of the African Court on Human and People's Rights, you find that there are so many cases against them because people get easily arrested, detained for not 2 weeks without trial, but months without trial, and so on. They are not told why. there is no exclusion of torture. There are places where people still get disappeared, and the human rights instruments there, in other words, national human rights institution, cannot do much because they themselves can get detained and so on. It's an issue that I think Africa needs to do more in order to deal with, especially when the African Union has adopted certain periods as periods of human rights.
I might just add, one, in terms of Section 13 of our Act, we are required to work with human rights organizations. They are a very important partner. So we actually have an interest in making sure that, over and above our mandate to promote and protect human rights, that we do protect the human rights defenders and try and make it safe. Because it's a country with lots of problems, but at least we are committed to doing that. And secondly, the national human rights institutions are also required under the Sustainable Development Goals to assist the Office of the High Commissioner in ensuring better protection for human rights defenders. And the Commission will be engaging in a whole lot of activity next year in doing so. The second issue was, what does the report say about human rights? Yes, you can see from the state that there are still lots of challenges in our country. And certainly the report does not reflect all the challenges. It only reflects those challenges which are brought to our attention. But we all know that a lot of work still has to be done in this country in addressing issues of human rights, gender-based violence, high levels of poverty and inequalities, and so forth. So a lot of work still has to be done. The only good thing is that there is commitment on the part of a body like ours and many others to basically ensure that we continue this battle for human rights. We come from a long, long way back, and I think we are making good progress going forward.
Do you have anything to add? Oh, you have another question?
Yes, just on that issue, would you say that activists in South Africa are safe, or do you find that they're increasingly becoming under threat?
Maybe Alex will talk to that. But all I'm simply saying is this, that the Human Rights Commission is here to protect rights being violated. So if it comes to our attention that the human rights defenders' rights are being violated, it's our business. And if we don't do anything, we'll be failing in our mandate to do so. But secondly, we'll be undermining our own interest as a commission, because we do need this partnership with human rights defenders. We work with them in order to fulfill our mandate to create the culture of human rights in this country.
For human rights defenders and activists will always require protection in our view, and that is a global phenomenon across the globe. I don't think that South Africa is that distinct from other similarly placed countries where there can be risks in certain circumstances, and otherwise, you have the protections of our constitutional democracy and our constitutional rights to sort of fall back on as well, which is an additional protective measure, unlike some other countries. But obviously, I think that there are circumstances in which it does become extremely, extremely dangerous. We've even seen recently and been quite concerned with reports of what has been happening with the Auditor General, where certain audits have been carried out and there have been issues. I think for ourselves as a Chapter 9 institution, for other activists, NGOs, other members of Chapter 9 institutions, I think they all require protection. And as a society, we're all responsible for ensuring the protection of our human rights defenders and activists across the board. And then maybe just to finish up for me on what does the report say about South Africa, I think it's such an interesting question. I think if you look at these statistics, you can see that the spectre of apartheid is still looming large over us and is still casting a long shadow. The statistics are undeniable. Black South Africans are being subjected to routine and frequent racial discrimination in South Africa. So that is something that is going to remain a priority for us as a commission. And it does call into question the effectiveness of our transformative undertakings. What have we done? Are are these mechanisms that we're using to try and transform and to change hearts and minds really working? And then I think that the second statistic certainly up there is giving us an indication that we still haven't gotten the basics right. So water, health, sanitation, we're seeing large gaps across the country, obviously disproportionately affecting communities of color and rural communities as well, where they don't have access to basic services, which we think are extremely crucial to your right to dignity as a South African, which is one of the most fundamental rights that we have in our constitution. So I think that's what the report says about us. So it says about South Africa that we still have a long way to go. Much has been achieved, but there is still much to do.
I've also been informed, my sister to advise you that on our website we have a report actually on human rights defenders, our reflections and the thinking going forward. It's a good read.
Thank you. Okay. I just also want to, I know Kateko has another question, but I just want to support what Alex has just said. I think it's also important, the media is a very important partner in all of this, and I think it's really important to remember that rights are interdependent and related, and we can't really separate rights. And while there is this, fascination with racial inequality, that it really, really is important to draw the connections between, these rights and socioeconomic rights, because they are part of the equality rights as well, and also to make the connection then to the social rights that people have, that they are all equally important and that they are all there to address the structural inequalities that Alex was speaking about that still exist, that inequality is structural and that we have to address them as structural problems. I'm going to take Kateko as the last and final question, and then after the question I'm going to close. We are available to the media afterwards if you want to do one-on-ones with any of the panel. So Kateko, can I take your last question?
Thank you. I'd like to put you on the spot a little bit. Apologize for that. Would you say that the insecurity of government funding impedes your independence and your work, especially to go against government departments whom you have identified as the least non-compliant? My second question would be, don't you think the criminal provision in the human rights constitution, it's time to maybe implement that, since you have identified non-compliance as one of the biggest issues?
Do you want to take either of those, or shall I say the other?
You want to start?
You can correct me if I say wrong.
It's okay.
Yeah, certainly on the issue of independence, there's an obligation by government to fund the commission adequately. And it's an issue which we will keep on addressing, and of course we do need more money. However, what I need to make it very clear is that our funding concerns have not undermined our ability to hold government to account where it is necessary. Of course, we would love to have more money. And secondly, we have made it very clear as a commission that where we feel that the inadequacy of that funding undermines severely our ability to conduct our work as a commission, we'll definitely raise it and maybe even go to court where necessary. And then the Section 4 of our Act, that is Section 22, which makes it a criminal offense to undermine the work of the Commission. It's certainly something which we have not been using a lot in the past, but we're certainly open to us, and we will use it when necessary. But as I was saying, there are many ways in which we can do this work, and we try as much as possible to find much more constructive ways of dealing with these issues. So on the issue, for example, of inadequate compliance, with our directives and recommendations, we do raise this from time to time with Parliament. We've raised this also with the Presidency and so forth. So it's work in progress. So we might be complaining there and there, but fundamentally, I don't think that we are at the level where non-compliance with our recommendations actually undermines our work. Nobody can really stand up and say to the Commission, go to hell. They might just pretend they didn't hear us.
Well, just to highlight the fact that the issue of adequate financial resources or adequate resources is one of the requirements in the Paris Principles that I spoke about. That the government is required under the Paris Principles. Government of any country that establishes a national human rights institution, it's required to make sufficient resources provision for that institution to be able to do its work independently and not have the fear that if we challenge anything, the government is not going to give us resources next time and so on. You know, in other words, it is part of now, I could say, universal human rights understanding that governments have to give adequate financial support to national human rights institutions. It is even more important for us in South Africa because we came yesterday out of the apartheid scenario, and there is a lot that needs to be done in order to correct the damage that was caused by apartheid. Once apartheid didn't provide housing, didn't provide water, didn't provide health care, didn't provide sufficient schools and education for what we now say we are equal. And we are required to make sure that what is in the Constitution is actually implemented by everybody, in particular by the government. And we need to let people know that they've got these rights. We need to let people know that when those rights are threatened or violated, they've got somewhere to go, and that they know how to deal with the threats or the violations of their rights. And where rights are violated, in any case, the Constitution requires us to take steps to provide adequate redress. And we need then resources in order to do that, in order to provide that redress to what we call. So the case for resources is quite important in our context as a country that has just recently emerged from apartheid.
Thank you, Chairperson. Right, I'd just like to thank everybody who came. I'm going to hand over to the CEO to do some closing remarks. The report will be available, if not already, on our website. So the electronic, is it already on the website? The report is already on the website if anybody wants to download it from there. Thank you very much everyone for coming, and I'd just like to hand over to our CEO to close.
Thank you, colleagues. I just want to say, the protection mandate of the Commission is a very important one. It is through this mandate where ordinary South Africans can come to the Human Rights Commission to complain about their rights being violated without paying anything. And we have to provide redress for that. So in that sense, actually, it can really go a long way in ensuring that, we do basically create a culture of human rights, and we do become defenders of many of our people whose rights are being violated and continue to be violated. The challenge for us as a Commission is that we really need to enhance this mandate and make sure that we are able to address the needs of many of our people as much as possible. And that's one of the things which we as a Commission have to be thinking about going forward. Now, there are two aspects to this mandate. One, of course, is complaints-driven, which has led to this report. But we're also required as the Commission to basically act on our own initiative where we see human rights being violated. And we are also discussing how best can we do this. Because as you can see from our report, not every South African is able to come to the Human Rights Commission to complain. People in Kailisha, Alexander, and so forth, in rural areas. And that's where we also want to use our proactive mandate to be able to address human rights violations which are happening. Then secondly, is also the issue of us using alternative dispute resolution mechanisms to basically find a quicker way of addressing human rights violations. As it has been shown there, we're at around 38% and would like to increase that. The Australians actually resolve all the complaints at 65% of the Australian Human Rights Commission. And we also need to see how we can enhance this, because actually it's much quicker, but also helps, to create a much more constructive resolution of human rights. As African people for a long time, this has been one of the most important ways of resolving this. There's a problem, we solve it, we shake hands, we move forward, we don't do it again. So we actually need to look into that. And of course, the report also has to be improved as well in terms of access, in terms of the number of people who bring complaints to us, but also for us, to have much quicker turnaround times, in resolving complaints. So those are some of the things which we'll be working on, and hopefully next year, when you come here again, we'll have a much better report, a much more enriched report. So with those words, I really want to thank all of you from coming to listen to us and also helping us to inform the people of this country, our shareholders and the taxpayers, in terms of what we are doing. I also want to thank, the chair has already done, to thank colleagues in the Commission for all the hard work in putting this report, and for the Office of the CEO and other managers to helping to ensure that we keep this ship afloat and moving. Thank you.
Thank you very much, CEO. If you haven't signed our attendance register, please do so before you leave. Thank you very much, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Alex.
Yeah,